Fellow adventurers, you will recall that I was a minor part of the delegation which was sent to talk with a neighboring orc kingdom. A kingdom of relatively well-behaved and civilized orcs. While our negotiations were continuing, another delegation arrived at the palace from a much more traditional orc kingdom. Leading that delegation was a magnificent barbarian prince, there to woo the sweet and beautiful, by Orcish standards, princess. She was terrified by his brutish splendor, as were most of the local orcs. In particular, she was terrified that he would woo her the traditional way, by breaking into her boudoir one evening and kidnapping her. The armed guard which had accompanied our delegation found itself repurposed to help guard the palace. The first 2 weeks of negotiation between the orcs, however, went on without problems, and tensions eased. I spent my time as a runner, carrying questions and replies between the negotiators. I also spent a lot of time with the princess, since I wasn't considered a threat to anyone. The prince spent his time in athletic training and competition. Even to my half-orc eyes, it was obvious that he was a particularly fine physical specimen. And I could tell that the princess was coming to the same conclusion. Soon I found myself in the unexpected position of taking messages between the two of them. The official negotiators were unaware. The prince turned out to be much more progressive in his thinking than expected, and he was willing to follow the marital policies of his beloved's kingdom. The princess asked me to arrange one-on-one meetings between the two of them, and they started meeting under the watchful eye of the Vale's finest soldiers, without the knowledge of either orc faction. This isn't to say that the orcs were completely unaware of what was going on. The budding relationship between prince and princess was visible to all. After all the major points in their negotiations had been agreed, I cautiously suggested that the princess's mother be informed and asked to arrange the ceremonial abduction. The prince was completely satisfied with this idea. But the princess balked. She wanted something more traditional, without her parents' knowledge. The argument raged for hours, though quietly, politely, and passionately. The princess was obdurate. Finally, we came up with an acceptable compromise. The agreement between the two kingdoms was to be signed at noon in 2 days. We agreed that I would bring the prince to the princess that morning, that the two of them would then make their way to the prince's quarters together, and then a process from his quarters to the great hall where the signing would take place. It would provide the necessary symbolism that he had won her fair and square, rather than their union being only a product of the negotiation between kingdoms. We also agreed that all the security should be provided by my tribesmen from the Vale, to ensure that tempers didn't get too heated, which meant that I needed to talk with the leaders of my delegation and get their support. That interview was perhaps the most excruciating 2 hours of my life. They initially refused to be involved and berated me for my involvement. When the prince showed up at their door, they began to see the merits of my arrangements. I was already tired of talking, but the planning session that followed went on for many long hours. I realized for the first time that talking could be more exhausting than fighting. Eventually, the big day came. I did my minor part, leading the prince to the princess's quarters, and then leading the pair of them back to his quarters. Everything went without a hitch. Quiet reigned throughout the palace. As noon approached, a panicked buzz arose from the princess's quarters. Our guards could be seen at every intersection. Despite the alarm, the various dignitaries made their way to the Great Hall. Then the couple marched out of the prince's quarters, dressed in matching barbaric finery, escorted only by 4 Orcish maidens clad in white. They made their way to the Great Hall and stood by quietly as all the papers were signed. And then a party broke out. A week later, our delegation returned to the Vale with all our trade agreements signed and all our concerns alleviated. I carried several very interesting gifts from Prince and Princess for my part in their relationship. All in all, a very successful trip. Mr. Guildmaster,